surrounds all of our work in different ways. And what are these? How does land figure in our research, teaching, and design practices? Well, to assist in this inquiry, we turn to our 8 deans and heads, or their envoys, from the Faculty of Architecture. Each were tasked with explaining what does land mean to their own work, to their department, the faculty, and the disciplines. To consider land in all its material, spatial, and cultural dimensions, but always in relation to atmosphere. So in this format, each person has 16 slides to present their observations in just 8 minutes. Our time limit is strict, so when the slide presentation ends, there will be time to yield to the next presenter. I'd like to welcome our first speaker, who is Brian Rex from Architecture.
Hello. Okay. So, I want to talk about confusing or equating land and property. In this presentation, I'm going to refer to 3 different scales of our academic program, our professional role in the public, and our place as individual citizens. I moved from Austin, Texas to Montreal, Quebec for my grade 6 year. We lived in Dillard as Vermont on West Island. This walkway right here is the house I lived in. This walkway became yeah, that walkway was really important. I got into this design world because I wanted to design people's houses. The idea that a middle-class family would have land to buy a house is antiquated and impossible today. The architects I knew before I went to architecture school were all on TV. This was the first house I knew of that was designed by an architect, the Brady family house, by Mike Brady, right? School and land. Coming here to U of M, I've been fortunate to learn about land-based learning and biomimetics. They both are very literal ways of working with the land. Kyle Mo, in addressing how the Academy needs to work for relevance, says we are excellent at abstraction, but we have slipped in our connection to literal. I think this is most important in the land. Public and land. We have moved from land additions to the city to property subdivisions of the land, of the city. We have allowed the decisions about the environment to consolidate into the hands of the few that profit the most well, and we've seen the rise of corporate citizenship and its claim on the land. Profession and habitation, and habitation, excuse me. Advocacy mechanism. No longer engaged in the process of planning construction that it comes from it. Architecture has no real connection to this. Some people will say that we did it once, or once it never really happened, but there's reasons for us to. The result is that we've lost touch with the actual construction of the built environment and also how it's planned. So we end up in this kind of cul-de-sac culture. Ultimately, the thing that this seems to get to the most is the culture of exclusivity, which is a nice way of saying exclusion, enclaves, segregated communities. No words are better than important, of course. So land is a base. Nowhere in the ship, you can read about here, is as problematic as our abstract relationship with the land. Land is a base human resource. Abstracting our sense of the land, allowing it to be held in speculation, in its short-term gain is hurting the planet, hurting our sense of humanity, and our profession. The city should be added to in predictable, equitable, and economical ways that respect the fact of land and habitation patterns that benefit people, not profits. The structure of additions to the city should be ordered by the open systems of their environment, mitigating exclusivity and speculation in the city. To me, Scott Brown, across my career, was more and more I realized really is a bedrock for understanding the way the value of seeing was literally there, taking the land at face value and letting natural and human systems explain themselves. I'm really fortunate to be here to learn more about real land-based learning and indigenous thinking. But one of the fascinating things is we live in a place fortunate enough we live in a place fortunate enough where this all-encompassing grid that came up from the States is peeled back to reveal a more natural system that's laying there. And still was part of the city, and still, for a long time, the city avoided the grid. The city stayed out of the grid, and stayed in this natural system that followed waterways, to the watersheds. But even on a different scale, some of those same old river runs, like this Pembina, still have at a different scale that same kind of space. There's a space between this grid space, the river lot systems, where there's a flexibility and a malleability. Yeah, so we got the old power in colonizing the POSS. This past fall, I was lucky to work with some students, 15 students, on a study of hybrids. And we followed a lot of these backgrounds and revolutionary ideas from studies. And for instance, Colin and Ryan Rudd here collapsed and went on to it. So I was looking at my interest right now is all about Pembina. I realize now that if you follow Pembina and go straight, you'll end in Monterey, Mexico. So this was the city until fairly recent. And the city has this natural shape, which isn't, which in a way, you know, there's no freeway involved in this. There are a lot of railroad tracks involved in this, but sorry, I lost my place. Here it is. So oh yeah, let's go to the next one. But now we're at a point now where all that natural control and all of that historical trace and palimpsestic space of those river lots and everything that come before it, we've exceeded that, and we've gotten ourselves out on the grid, and we don't really have, the culture doesn't really have the kind of things that we had before. They used to be able to guide it as a sort of a Winnipeg way of working. So now we have this kind of thing coming back in where those are, yeah, you all know what this is. One of the beautiful things about the school, you know, where we need to get control back of how we lay out the city, one of the beautiful things about the school is, as I found on some the Manitoba Archives web pages from Flickr pages, there's all these wonderful histories and historical conditions of the school having an impact and saying things fantastical about the way the city could be, that really spoke to this idea that land is not property and property is not land, and they're separate things. But ultimately, going back to that very first part of this, I think it would really help the profession and help the city and help the culture and help us all, and maybe even help homelessness, if we could get back to the place where people were involved as more than just consumers of the habitations they make and live in. Yeah, I'm done. Sorry, thank you.
So now we'll have Richard Milgram, the head of city planning.
I get to cheat a bit. I've just come back from Toronto, where I was doing an accreditation visit somewhere else, which happens to be where I did my PhD. So I sort of went down this nostalgic rabbit hole of critical urbanism while I was there. And it sort of came into this in some ways. Oh, there's lots of time. I could.
Yeah, you have time.
Yeah, but I don't know that I have enough to say once everything comes up. So let's see. There's me. So I mean, I will say as a starting point that I'm at a weird moment as well, where I'm questioning a lot of things that are going on in the practice of planning, and I think that's what we should be doing in universities anyway. And actually, I thank Brian for one of the things he just said, because he said this confusion between land and property. And that's really partly where I was going with this as well. I mean, we do talk about land in planning, but I think not in a much more abstracted way, which has more to do with its financial value than the land in its material and beneficial forms. Land plus, since that's the theme of this event, for planning is obviously when land comes into contact with human endeavor. So I sort of went through a few of these things, and I thought of some other ones that hadn't come up, and I say this one as sort of a context setting for planning, because land plus politics, it's impossible to avoid politics if you're in planning. And what I will return to is the importance of activism. We cannot trust politicians to do the right thing if we don't hold them accountable. So planners are often held accountable for the state of the city, but it's important not to confuse planning, which involves many people, many of whom are more powerful than planners, with planners. Planning and planners. So, I mean, I'm talking here mostly about planning and trying not to blame the planners for some of the things that happen. I've done reports where I've had to follow the mistakes of politicians, and the planners keep saying, well, if you've done that, now you've got to do this. And then the politicians do something, and you get the next report that says, well, now you've done that, now you've got to do this. Anyway. So land comes in when we talk about land use planning. Probably the thing that most people think all planners do, but that isn't actually the case. This is a land use map from Vancouver, as you can see, in 1984. And I mean, they are in a way an abstraction. I mean, they're not experiential. And unfortunately, a lot of planning happens at this sort of scale, which doesn't get down to the experience of people, nor to the contributions that land might be making. The other problem I'm having right now is how much, particularly in Winnipeg, the various pieces of planning have been fragmented. So planners in Winnipeg who do transportation rarely speak to the planners who do land use planning, which just seems so bizarre. Winnipeg is getting slightly better at this, but you know, the Southwest Transit Corridor along Pembina was designed without ever thinking about the impacts it might have on density and land use planning. So they had to sort of come back and backfill that. The other thing I was thinking about a little bit, although I won't spend much time on because I only have about 7 minutes left, this is the grid that Brian was just talking about. We couldn't have planned this better in some ways. Everything you put up, I thought I've got that as well. This is the grid from the plane, landing in Winnipeg, obviously, in the winter. And I was thinking about how this grid was about, it was a tool of colonization. It was also planning and surveying. So planning is always implicated in colonization, but it's also part of commodification. So I said I went down a few rabbit holes. So one of them was checking a few good Marxist definitions of terms. So thinking about commodification and the idea that both the public and the private realms can be commodified, and those are fairly significant problems in the development of cities, particularly if we are concerned about social and environmental goods, because those are much harder to quantify and to commodify. I was at the public meeting when the Mir Hotel, which you can see in the bottom left, was being discussed. And this was right after the time when I thought, you know, the city's finally done something relatively right in that they've made the whole waterfront public. And now, but they had one piece left that was owned by the city, and they said, no, but the highest and best use for that is not a park. It had to be something, again, that could be commodified, that could give us some sort of return. I also went into this idea again, land use planning. But the sort of use that is mostly being talked about when planners are considering land uses has far more to do with exchange value than with use value. It's much more, I mean, when you look at the huge swaths of single-family detached houses, these are not particularly usable neighborhoods. You have to go a pretty long way to find anything other than someone else's garage. Just wanted to end with what I thought was a positive example, although it sort of tanks at the end of this. This was the Places to Grow legislation that the province of Ontario introduced in 2006, which was looking at how to preserve ecological function and green space in particular in the Golden Horseshoe around Toronto and Hamilton. So you can see in the green was the green belt that was famously sort of protected by this legislation in 2006. But what was also interesting to me about this is the way various levels of government came together and collaborated, and also the way various types of planning were used and brought together to make this possible. So one of the things, this will change again in a sec, was to say to certain regions like Waterloo and Cambridge that if you accept higher density to protect the green belt, we will fund better transportation with a light rail system for you in that area. So there was this sort of give and take and an understanding that if you brought all of these different planning tools together, you could actually make some positive changes. If any of you follow the news about things like this, you will know that the current Conservative government in Ontario is in the process of trying, as previous Conservative governments have done, to undermine this progressive ideal. So Ford there has just announced, well, a little while late in the year, announced that he's going to encourage the building of single-family housing in the Greenbelt. Blaming immigrants, by the way, there's so much immigration that we have to build more single-family houses. There's plenty of evidence that says that it's actually possible to accommodate that within the existing urban areas, but apparently his developer friends have a different opinion. So if you go through the internet, you will find a number of different versions of resistance to this. This is from the Green Party, trying to fight the suburbanization of farmland. And the other one I found was that was particularly good was from the Environmental Defense Fund, which is a grassroots organization that raises money and awareness around keeping the environmental assets intact. And so this gets me back to the need for environmental activism to keep, or land and activism to keep the politicians' feet to the fire. And I will stop there because it's going to stop anyway. Thanks.
Now we'll hear from Jason Shields, who's representing interior design.
Thank you. I talk pretty loud, so you should be good. Okay. Terrific. Thank you so much. So, as you probably have already figured out here, I am not the dean or the head or the chair. So I have not gotten some recent promotion that you have not heard about. But I am here to actually represent the interior design department because we've been doing some very interesting work in the studio recently. What I'm going to start off with, though, is a little bit of my past and a bit of my experience in relation to site. The image that you see here is an image that I actually made over 11 years ago while I was at this university itself. This image is a representation of the nostalgia that I have, in a sense, for this idea of site. The project required us to create imagery that is to represent something that was important to us. And as many would maybe think from an interior designer, I would move towards interior spaces of grand nature. But I look back to the nostalgic nature of my childhood and the spaces that I enjoyed the most, and that was these forests. So in winter of 2012, I went through and I walked through all these spaces and I photographed them, looking at the unique elements of it. When I began to think further about what I wanted to do and how I wanted to teach within the studio this term, I looked back at this book. And as you can see, it's not digital images, it is a book. This is a book that I made 11 years ago and still sits on my bookshelf today. Through pulling out this book, though, I began to realize the importance of the site, and I began to think as an interior designer, how can I begin to merge these two modalities, or how can I begin to have a deeper understanding of what the site can provide? So it became a goal of mine within the studios in interior design, both graduate and undergraduate, to try to make more connection between this idea of site and this idea of interior. And again, it's just out of pure luck. Richard was talking about the Mirror Hotel, and the site that we are looking at here is right beside it. It's actually the Cibo Waterfront Cafe. This is a terrific little site image that the students did. And what we're going to speak of is how we use digital tools to better understand this site at Cibo, with the intent of the studio to create a nature center or an interpretive center that looks towards conservation, stewardship, and other elements of that nature. So of course, similar to what I did 12 years ago, the first thing I wanted to do was to just start to walk around the bushes and go around the forest. I think again, that speaks to that idea of that nostalgia, that longing to actually be with the land. From here, I was able to kind of analyze and better understand the flora, the fauna, the conditions surrounding it, and to actually separate myself from the building exterior and the interior itself. To me, this is kind of that first stage of understanding the interior. We start out at a very zoomed out pace and we begin to get closer. To engage with this, we like to do cross-disciplinary work, and we were working with the Fab Lab, and in this instance, John Watts. We brought him down to the site with some students, and we actually did the drone scan of the entire area. Instead of simply having John do the drone scan himself, I thought it'd be important the students understand this kind of process. You see on the far right there, that's the actual image that you see at the drone in real time, so you can actually watch what's going on above as this drone flies. I guess the question is, why are we doing this drone scan? What is the importance of it, and how can it relate back to interiors? Here's the first output of what you can see. The image right there, that's the Mirror Hotel that Richard wasn't excited about. And right there is the Cibo. That is our site that we're discussing. Right now, this 3D drone scan may be a little difficult to read without the context. And so we began to think, what type of attributes can this provide us that can assist us in better understanding interior space, especially in this increasingly digitized world? For those of you who are in interiors or who have worked with some of these softwares, this here is Revit. This is kind of the bread and butter that we often use to create 3D models. It doesn't like to play so well with a lot of other things. So the first thing you see here is just a simple kind of block formation of the Mirror Hotel, and then a more kind of detailed model of the actual site itself. The challenge we had is, how do we take that drone scan and place that into the digital model and use it for actual data-rich purposes? So here you can see, much like many things when we first try it, we inserted the drone scan and it went wherever it wanted. It really did not have any conjunction as to where it wanted to be placed. We did all the right things and it still didn't want to play ball. So as we began to work with it, we see here the purple portion is the actual scan drone portion, and the part behind it was that model that we saw in the last image. The goal here to align the two so that we can create a model that encompasses the interior elements, the architectural elements, as well as the data and imagery from the site. Here you can see once these two have been combined, it becomes a much more clear image and provides us with context of the site, and it gives us a better tool to be able to analyze what we want from interiors in a sense. So you could even begin to think about, what are those views to the outside? How does this actually begin to influence us? And the next thing that I wanted to talk about was, sometimes we get a little bit lost into kind of this digital world, and I find that we want to use these digital tools to create physical manifestations. So before moving any further into this analysis, we asked students to take that 3D drone scan and to understand the topographic information. The topographic information was then relayed to a CNC router, which properly cut out all of the landscapes to provide it for a model. And you see on the bottom image there, it was actually hollowed out to be able to place the basement of the building directly into the land itself. Here gives a bit of an example of how that is to be built sequentially. This here shows how the Cibo model itself actually appears and its integration with the land. From the top image on the left, you can see that the roof pulls off, that next floor pulls off, and then we actually build ourselves into the ground itself. The imageries that you see around it here, well, not kind of showing the exact purpose of the site, the exact kind of everything that's in there, what it does allow us is to do a lot of different experimentation as well through a physical manner and not only through digital. And that, I think, is a very important aspect of this. But I wanted to bring this back to something that's a little bit closer to home. And so for those of you who want to experiment and kind of look at these modalities, here's the university. Right there is Chancellor Hall, and you can see a few different buildings in the background. We have all of these resources here at the university as well to be able to begin to experiment with. A lot of these models are already hosted down in the Fab Lab, and you're actually able to rent the drone scanner and do these things yourself. So I want to kind of show an image here just to show the possibilities and that you don't really have to go far to be able to engage with this idea of digital analysis of site. Here again, you see that we've integrated the Revit model, we've integrated the drone scan, and some of these that you see over here are actual Rhino models as well too. So it's not that we're all playing in a singular sandbox. We're trying to work with a multitude of applications and a multitude of disciplines to better understand how the interiority of the site functions. Through these analysis, we've found that the drone scanning to be a very crucial tool. And I think talking about some of these outcomes will be helpful for those to understand. It actually is a tool to analyze the connections and the access to the outdoor space. It allows us to provide safe and non-intrusive analysis. It does not require one to observe the existing conditions of the site, or the ground-based flora and fauna, and allows you to enter into spaces that could possibly be unsafe. It provides the students, as well as us, 24/7 remote access to the site to understand its dimensions, its value, and to let us reflect on it in a non-situ type of situation. And I wanted to kind of end on this image here, as we was discussing with the committee initially about what this conversation could be about. And I simply posed it as often with interiors and landscape, there's just one thing that separates us many times, and that's a window. And so I offer you to kind of look into this window and see what you can find out about the land. And I thank you again for your time. And if you have any questions about drone scanning, always feel free to come and bother me. I'd be more than happy to chat.
Now we'll hear from Anna Thurmeyer from the Department of Landscape Architecture.
So good afternoon. Does the mic work actually? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, super. Thank you for the question. What means land for our profession and department? I will speak from the perspective of a landscape architect and of my professional career. Doing this, and I think it's not moving. Is it?
It will come.
Okay. Yeah. Doing this will showcase work assignments in different places, sites, and countries. So navigating professional collaborations and design ideas over time, this presentation is on land and celebrating atmospheres. I will start with 3 projects from my time at Burger Landscape Architects in Munich. The magnificent existing stock of trees formed the starting point of this project. The goal was to transform an overgrown wildwood into a central public park. Carefully designed spaces were laid out in small clearings between the overarching canopies of trees. They became points of destination, navigating visitors without disturbing the wildwood's atmosphere. As young designers in Munich, we from Burger Landscape Architects made every effort to design and construct in a very progressive way. However, working with this piece of land taught me early on how the preservation of existing resources must be the highest priority and how it can be done most sensibly. Another project from my time at Burger Landscape Architects is Park Village. It is a miniature town designed by business use only. The Dutch architect MVRDV developed the master plan, while several other architects' firms created the buildings. The various forms of architecture employed are heterogeneous in terms of their heights, facades, materials, colors, and rooftops. As landscape architects, we laid out the building in a field consisting of flagstones and the gaps between them. The heterogeneity of the architectural style is united through the strict uniformity of the exterior space. Grass grows like a green net in the cracks between the stones. The concept of cracks and fugues on top of an underground parking showcase how a simple measure can take ecological and aesthetical effects and turn them into a formative element of design. Fünf Höfe is a project right in the heart of Munich. A historic building complex was opened for art, commerce, restaurant facilities in 2003. The Swiss architect Herzog de Meuron penetrated the closed-off feel by incorporating arcades and courtyards typical of Munich's architecture. We as landscape architects considered that our task was to mold the courtyards into self-confident personalities. The courtyards and terraces have a very tranquil and homogeneous form. Their atmosphere contrasts starkly with the manifold attractions of lively arcades. They act as quiet, fixed points in the city landscape. Their memorable nature also converts the courtyards into a means of orientation with the arcades. Employing the simplest means and the fewest materials can create resonant spaces. Through the windows of the shops in the arcade, the trees in this courtyard seem to be like the backdrop in a picture frame. A trough of black concrete offers the required base structure for this roof vegetation. In the fall, the Japanese maples put on a show of colors. Collaborating with architects, engineering, construction firms, and the clients on extremely complex site conditions, I've learned to act as a master builder rather than a decorateur. In 2000, Dietmar and I founded the landscape architecture firm Straub-Thurmaier. The design that won the Botanical Garden Design Competition 26 consists of a voluminous loop which occupies the horizon and catches the eye in a flat landscape. The ring offers visitors a destination, a sense of security, and a view into the garden from a raised location. The dike protects against wind and flooding and makes it possible to cultivate things inside that do not appear outside. And here we go. Imagine one morning you wake up in the middle of an unknown land and hear silence instead of familiar noises. Silence is a culture shock. After 15 years, I'm accustomed to suburban life in the prairies, and I thrive by Winnipeg's magnificent stock of trees, among many other things. The urban forest contributes to Winnipeg's identity and atmosphere, what I consider home. What would happen if the 8 million trees could vote in civic elections? What kind of electoral program would attract them to the polls? The deep crisis of global tree diseases, missing regulation to protect significant and healthy trees on private properties, and municipal policies that push massive expansion call for extreme reform. Moving to Manitoba, it was obviously that we, as designers, had to approach projects in Winnipeg differently. With a monoculture and trimmed lawns cultivated on neighboring properties, the garden rooted in clay exemplifies a sustainable space, prioritizing living things, urban recycling, and nature. One of the key ideas was to upgrade and transform salvaged wooden beams into a new context. We tested solvent-free paint as a non-toxic wood preservation. The paint is made from cold-pressed organic linseed oil. It is safe to use and was applied to the horizontal wooden beam in bright and luminous colors. Despite the full sun, periodic rain, and complete snow coverage, the linseed oil colors remained bold and pleasant for many years. The paint is economical, environmental friendly, and most of all, very long-lasting. There is a need of basic environmental and applied green technology research in the prairies. In collaboration with Chris Dick at the former Alternative Village, I tested ecological construction methods in the extreme prairie climate of Winnipeg. After the successful construction, the gravel lawn thrived for 3 years. Daily use of as a parking lot ended the lawn's existence. Students, alumni, and teachers, support staff, and friends have joined the department in celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Master of Landscape Architecture program at the University of Manitoba. Events through this academic year include the homecoming gathering, fundraising, the 50th anniversary scholarship, community planting, exhibitions, invited speakers like today, and including the symposium. I want to thank everyone involved in preparing the anniversary celebrations. No matter from what angle we discuss land and its meaning, land is the essential basis for life, for people, animals, and plants. Everything that sustains life comes from and returns to land. Everything that we do to the land, we do it to ourselves. Landscape architects advocate and optimistically design the common ground. Professional practice and academia vow to enhance environmental and cultural systems, enabling them to adapt to climate change and mitigate its root causes. Thank you.
And now we'll have Jay Songchon, who's chair of environmental design.
Okay, I'm going to wait, yeah.
So there'll be
Breathe in, breathe out.
a few more seconds.
Okay, no, I'll start when it starts. Okay, I'm going to start briefly. I'm following a 3-book rule. So for students, it's always good to read some text before engaging a class. Remember? So I plowed through this 3 books that I'm introducing to you. And roughly framing my position based on these 3 books today. And those are Land Without Ownership, and the scriptedness of land, and Dialogic Nature of Land. And I encourage you to read these books as well, and these are really fundamental. And when missionaries arrived in Africa, we had the land and they had the Bible. After the prayer, they had the land and we had the Bible. The sense of and title of ownership over land was and is at the center of our bloody history. Lands are measured, regulated, and owned and fought over. Now let's imagine a land and delete the idea of ownership. What does it look like? It was earth, ground, and soil before we measured, bordered, and regulated it to claim our desired ownership. Land for environmental design may exist before and beyond this ownership and regulation, a deregulated or decapitalized land, an atmospheric land. Claiming ownership over an entity that is 4.5 billion years old is a hideous imagination. A land without desire of ownership may be measured but maintained unregulated or deregulated. This land then is not a territory of clarity, but a territory of curiosity, a proto-land. When we let go of our ownership, then we see others, our co-inhabitants of this land. They coexist, co-inhabit, and co-evolve without borders or titles. Borders and boundaries become futile. They don't own it, we don't own them. On this deregulated land, new imagination of coexistence may emerge and flourish. Land is always scripted. It has been scripting for 4.5 billion years. The idea of virgin land is this fictitious construct, a mere image of our desire for a clear title. As David Harvey says, there's nothing unnatural about city. We need to read the script of the land beyond the dialectics of natural and artificial. Contemporary lands are a jumble of desires. The ownership diagram of Shibuya Station is a landscape of desires. Clarity cannot be the objective. The regulation can only be managerial. The overscripted landscape offers new opportunities then and new imaginations. imagination out of the chaotic overdrive of desires. Lands are lost and found in between desires. Following between the cracks of regulated desires, these lands invite and entice new air and new forms of living and co-presence. And in turn, they question the bordering desires. These in-between lands are catalytic lands which can dismantle existing regulation and offer new logics. On a deregulated land, edges are no longer borders or demarcation of ownership, but rather a state of threshold or even an experiential space. One of my favorite aspect of this is a tilt landscape at Prada shop in Herzogenaurach on Aoyama. The 5 to 10 degree tilt signals the body movement from public to private. The thickness of land offers interiority that undermines the superficial desires on the surface. These non-lands, non-spaces under the land, crossing borders of existing ownership. This land of interiority ought to be imagined beyond its current functions as corridors. As deregulated territories, its dynamics can offer new imagination of land above on the surface. With the sea level rising, the land is no longer the fixity. It is no longer the standing truth where ownership and land values are based on. Land then can be imagined, constructed over the ground and surfaces or water. In this sense, all built surfaces are constructed lands over the ground or surface over the mothership earth. Land then floats and hovers, and land exists or emerges when flows register on the surfaces. The land without ownership encourages or invites flows, and the flow registers the land. The free-to-roam policy movement in Scandinavian countries and parts of UK is a form of deregulated recognition of the land that emerges when roamed. We need new lenses and tools. We need to remap and rechart the land based on the flows. Different forms of flows reveals different forms of lands. Atmospheric lands may only emerge when charted, or they can only be detected by charting the animated conditions. Land, then, is temporal. It comes and goes. It's not fixed. It is also seasonal. When we let go of our fixation, the opportunity of temporal land emerges, opportunity of cohabitation, not by setting the boundaries, but by temporal or seasonal overlap. Land exists in time. We can now argue a position that land exists in form of dialogue, a dialogue with the past, existing scripts, co-inhabitants, and with the flows. The dialogic nature of lands are the teachings of many indigenous cultures. The power of the land lies in the dialogue and the elusive forms of narratives, not in its physical image. The land that environmental design can imagine are lands without regulated ownership and without boundaries. It is neither here or there. It always was beyond our grasp. If we erase our desires, the lands will emerge and begin to host coexistences and become clearer in our stories. I'm excited to discover these lands through the dialogues at the symposium Land Plus. Thank you.
Hi. This talk focuses on the relationship between land and photography. I argue that photography is a tool to document and shape narratives embedded in histories. Using an interdisciplinary method informed by cultural analysis, I will show you some evidence to back up my assertions. We'll be looking at some images by two Irish photographers, Anthony Haughey and David Farrell. Both have completed extensive photographic studies along the borderlines that partition Northern Ireland from the Republic in the south. The impact of this action continues to have enormous and lasting effects on their homelands. In 2019, Haughey was part of the exhibition Field Notes from the Border, which reflected the anxiety of the prospect of a return to a hard border brought on by Brexit. Consider now some of Haughey's images from that project. Ithacu stands on the bridge at Taylor's Folly that crosses the Armagh Loch border. She had to wait as an immigrant in Ireland from Nigeria for 10 years in a direct provision center for a decision on her family's asylum application. It should have taken 6 months. Anthropologist Fiona Murphy uses this image in her essay, The Emerald Curtain, when she discusses the concerns of the Irish caused by imposed boundaries and borders. This steel railroad bridge was destroyed by the British Army explosives in the 1970s. It marked the Carnarvon-Fermanagh border that now runs through its abandoned ruins. In 2018, while on a research trip to Ireland, I spent the afternoon with Anthony Haughey. He drove my partner Richard and I along the border region through the areas where he continues to photograph. Anthony explained that the Troubles, which took place between 1968 and 1989, were a site where Ireland's border was under hyper surveillance from the British Army watchtowers and patrolling helicopters, and it was the most militarized surveillance area in Western Europe. Following the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, much of the border infrastructure was dismantled and removed. However, traces remained on the land, and these sites stand as reminders of past conflicts, the many narratives of surveillance and conflict. The image that you just saw was the fireworks shop, which is a semiotic reminder that a different kind of fireworks had taken place in these locations. Here we see an installation image from the photo gallery in Dublin, which highlights a drone technology video that showed the border as it arbitrarily wound across the country. The photographer notes how the surveillance of this boundary was like the gaze of the Foucauldian panopticon, which illustrates the power imbalance between the individual being watched and the power of the watcher. But it's important that we have to bring research and imagery back to the communities in which they're made. And this is an installation shot from Haughey's work being installed at the Regional Cultural Center in Letterkenny. David Farrell also invites us to look closely at the borderlands. The next 7 images that I will show are made in Coggleston Wood, County Meath, just south of the border between the North and the Republic. They were part of a larger project that Farrell began in 1999 that documents searches for groups that were disappeared by the Irish Republican Army in the 1970s and 80s. Remains of the disappeared are found after extensive searches in the wooded area just south of the border, even though they were killed in the north. This required large sections of woodlands to be cleared to allow the excavations. Farrell reflects that this extensive photographic project has allowed him to consider human mortality and its relationship to the earth as a storehouse of facts, fictions, and memories. As we look closer at these images, we can see a land where secrets are hidden. Farrell's images document how nature responded to the excavations by reclaiming the woods, and eventually by returning them to a state that hid the evidence of the events that had taken place there. These photographs serve as a record of the effects of a human presence and its sometimes brutal impact on the natural environment. These images are also provocations for a reflection to broaden our understanding of the histories and narratives that play out upon the lands they represent. These photographs act as small acts of memory, reminiscent of the dangers that boundaries inflicted on the land have in escalating conflicts when acts of territorializing occur. In conclusion, as the curator of the exhibition Post-Picturesque, Photographing Ireland, Laurel Brandy has argued, these Irish photographers, they make work that is thought-provoking, critical, beautiful, and troubling. But their photographs reach beyond mere pictures. Thank you.
What grounds research? What fields of knowledge sustain research and design? How does research navigate difficult terrains, covering vast territories, encountering new horizons, negotiating thickets and sinkholes and weeds of misinformation, while opening new frontiers and ideally returning with beautiful seeds of new knowledge to enrich the discipline? I was asked what land means to the program I chair, a PhD program, a doctorate of philosophy, which got its name in the Middle Ages when doctor from Latin meant teacher, and philosophy from Greek implied a lover, philo, of knowledge, Sophia. What a rare privilege and responsibility to be an amorous doctor of Sophia, a perpetual learner and lover of knowledge. What grounds philosophical research in architecture, design, and planning? Every PhD plots its own path, yet the obligation to love knowledge in a grounded way permeates every meaningful study. Some profound desire to deepen love of our most precious yet precarious human resource, cultural knowledge, enriching stories, and disciplinary history. Where does knowledge grow? In many cultures, knowledge emerges from the land and takes varied forms: chthonic gods, speaking trees, emanating vapors, oracular chambers, animal intelligence, hive minds of plant life and understories of organic reason, entrails of sacrificed animals, indigenous knowledge, and mushrooms at the end of the world. Yet such disclosures are never direct. Like language, they require loving, caring interpretation. For ancient Greek philosophers and poets, fields of knowledge grew from special groves. Every philosophical dialogue of Plato is grounded, sited, located in the land in a particular inhabited region, a chora. Socrates' favorite place for sowing knowledge was a shady grove saturated with myth and meaning. Its image is preserved in a 2,500-year-old song performed in the theater of Dionysus by a chorus of dancers who welcome a guest with these words: "Stranger, in this chora of fine horses, you have come to earth's fairest home. Here the nightingale, a constant guest, trills her clear note under the trees of green glades, dwelling amid the wine-dark ivy in the gods in violet foliage. Rich in berries and fruit, unvisited by the sun, unvexed by the wind of any storm, here the reveler Dionysus ever walks, companion of the nymphs that nursed him, nor have the choruses of muses shunned this place, nor Aphrodite of the golden rain." What grounds research? A love of knowledge, care, curiosity, desire, discourse, questions, language, and metaphor. The most earthy element of our material imagination, the stuff of dreams and of bodies. Where would our words be without mouths and fleshy tongues, lips and teeth, microclimates of saliva and air, this cavernous carnal gorge that simultaneously breathes and speaks and thinks? Land, an ever-replenishing source of knowledge, a rich terrain, a fertile field, fruitful, nourishing, resilient, from which knowledge grows, understanding rises, new insights blossom, maelstroms of ideas swirl, and forgotten truths sometimes erupt with volcanic force. Land, a contested terrain. Like properties, knowledge fields can be ruled ruthlessly by landlords, fought over for land rights, renegotiated for lands back. Landless. There are nearly 90 million landless people in the world, 90 million forcibly displaced from their homelands, including 27 million refugees right now seeking a place to land. Social philosopher Bruno Latour argued in his latest book, his last book, Down to Earth, that we must bring scholarly attention, political agency, and our most radical creativity and ethical imagination down to earth. For society's most urgent challenges, from the migratory crisis to the climate crisis, demand a renewed philosophy that looks not to the stars for divine inspiration, but to the profundity and precarity of shared ground that we stand on. How does research proceed? Via encounter with the world and world of thought, through reading, wandering through vineyards of text, getting lost in thickets and tripping over thorny roots while becoming drunk on its fruits and nuts, and articulate by plucking and polishing its unearthed gems. Research proceeds also via encounter with the page, the parchment, the page itself, the stuff of pressed plants, tree pulp and fibers, originally prepared skins of animals, living flesh of calf and lamb, and lately via the liquid crystal mined metals and processed plastics of our glowing screens. How is research shaped? With patience and labor and vision, perhaps of a topiary gardener, pruning and trimming, digging deep and getting dirty, or as a taster of vintage wines and new harvests, where cogitation is a kind of chewing and understanding a savoring and ecstatic social feast. How is research shared? Via common grounds and common language, across tables and places as sites of exchange, and over level playing fields where people can assemble and till the soil of discourse and discontent, for all radical knowledge is unsettling, and every shared terrain permits proximity, but also a kind of politics of propinquity, as Michael Sorkin liked to say, a closeness with critical distance that allows for a certain ontological hesitancy, a healthy skepticism that offers critical and utopian thinkers, artists, and creative scholars the opportunity to intervene. For this presentation, I was originally thinking to plow through a long reading list that might convey the landscape of scholarship and design, the rich potential for cross-fertilization with adjacent fields, and the most fertile sites of inquiry. But instead, as you may have noticed, I've offered a poetic reverie on the grounds of research as residing in questions, care, curiosity, love, language, and above all, imagination. At the start of Oscar Wilde's dialogue on the decay of lying, the poet is at work in a chamber when a friend enters through the open terrace window and implores the poet to leave for the landscape. With these words, "It is a perfectly lovely afternoon. The air is exquisite. There is a mist upon the woods like the purple bloom of a plum. Let us go and lie on the grass and enjoy nature." But Oscar Wilde's contrarian poet replies with what I will take as my closing provocation. "Enjoy nature? I am glad to say I've entirely lost that faculty. Art makes us love nature more, revealing to us secrets that had escaped our observation. My own experience is that the more we study art, the less we care for nature. What art reveals is nature's lack of design and extraordinary monotony. Infinite variety is found in imagination." That's Wilde.
The beauty of the land is awesome. It evokes wonder and curiosity and provokes discovery. Its magnificence is more than human. The Great Salt Lake is wondrous. On a calm day, the surface is like a mirror, but on a windy day, the waves whip up a salty foam that holds its shape for days. This is the second saltiest body of water on Earth, second only to the Dead Sea. The Great Salt Lake may soon be a Dead Sea, as it is quickly shrinking and may disappear within 5 years. The wonder of the landscape inspires us. Sometimes we are inspired to blast tunnels through rocky mountains to move ourselves and our stuff from one place to another. And when we no longer need that infrastructure, it may stand as a scar on the land. But with creativity, we can transform that scar into something wondrous. The Tunnel of Light by Mad Architects transforms an inoperative train tunnel through the Kyotsu Gorge in Japan. When we connect with the land teaches us how to live. This is the foundation for land-based pedagogies. If we observe slowly and intently, we can learn how to create shelter, grow food, and live within simple means. We also can learn to design for nature's moments of awe and wonder. The House on Fire, a ruin in Bears Ears National Monument in southern Utah, is designed to provide protection and catch the late morning sun on a winter day. We must be open to the lessons that land offers us. Seismic plates shift below our feet. Water moves earth. Pebbles find their way into crevasses between large rocks. Landscapes we create can evoke sensations of the power of the land, as Shunyo Masuno does in his Japanese garden designs. And along a busy street in Colle d'Aversa, Italy, architect Jean Nouvel and landscape architect Gilles Clement created an apartment building that is alive and ever-changing with planted terraces. The land provides a place to connect through contemplation. A cup of green tea, the color of bright moss, complements the stillness of a bamboo grove. In the silence, we become observant, noticing the soft carpet of moss and the rhythm of the bamboo. Shunyo Masuno, Zen Buddhist priest and landscape architect, designs the land to allow us to physically and mentally step away from the barrage of information of our daily lives, and in his words, come face to face with ourselves. Masuno's gardens and landscapes are sites of tranquility and harmony. The asymmetrical compositions, a careful balance of human-made and natural, rough and smooth, straight and curved. Here, a narrow walk at the edge of a high-rise residential tower on a steeply sloping site in Hong Kong provides a moment of respite and refuge from the chaos of the city. It is a place for movement, but also for quiet introspection and contemplation, a place to consider how we want to live in the world in connection with the land. Our lives in the world and with the land are incomplete without an element of play. Land art can create stories, playfully questioning and transforming our relationship to the land. James Turrell constructed the spiral jetty at the Great Salt Lake in 1970. 6,000 tons of earth and rock form the spiral. In photos, the scale deceives the eye. In some years, depending on the snow melt, the 15-foot wide, 1,500-foot long coil has disappeared under the water. As children, the land can be our playground. As adults, we might play with the land. At the Tuscan town of Colle Valdelsa, a tall stone retaining wall separates the historic upper city from the newer industrial city below. Over the years, plants and vines have rooted themselves between the stones. An installation of red and white plastic chairs distorts our bearing and transforms the wall into a floor. And here in Winnipeg, the forks transform sidewalks into playful skating trails. Spaces for play are important in communities, and the morphology and material of the land suggest places to create community. Mountains protect from the wind, valleys hold rivers as sources of water, and plateaus provide places for gathering. At Wairebo village on the Indonesian island of Flores, houses stand 15 meters tall and mirror the form of nearby mountains. They house multiple families and bound a central space where the community gathers for meetings, ceremony, and play. While the land can suggest places for community, it can also make it difficult to construct communities. The houses in Manarola, one of the 5 towns of the Cinque Terre, or 5 lands, also known as the Italian Riviera, appear to perch precariously on the steep slope, supported by neighboring buildings and fortified by stone foundations. This is a community where neighbors are close, and the people, like the buildings, must rely on one another to thrive in this unique landscape. Traditional cultures tend to be close to the land and rely on community for protection and production. As settled cultures, we are producers. We produce the food we eat and the materials to create our shelters, not to mention all our stuff. We alter the land to facilitate our means of production. We create terraces on sloping hillsides for agriculture, like this image of a rice harvest in Japan. A basic act of cut and fill, the land was carved into terraces with irrigation ditches to move water between the rice paddies. We remove native trees and replace them with monocultures, such as rubber or palm trees for oil and sugar, like in this image of a palm sugar shack in Indonesia. We also alter the land to mine and process precious ores, like this former copper refinery in Inujima, Japan, now an art museum. We need these ores to produce our stuff, like our cell phones, copper from North and South America, tellurium from Japan and Canada, lithium from Australia, Chile, Argentina, and China, cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo. The land is in our phones. But who is doing the mining of these precious ores? Are they paid a living wage? Do they work in safe conditions? Do we even consider that when we buy a cell phone? And who picked the coffee beans that were shipped, roasted, packaged, ground, brewed, and poured into your cup this morning? Where did they come from? Perhaps here, Flores Island. Coffee doesn't grow in Canada, so what is the true cost of your $2 cup of Timmy's? And who's really paying the price of our love affair with coffee? What is the story of these landscapes? Pinawa was Manitoba's first hydroelectric station, providing electricity crucial to Winnipeg's growth in the early 20th century. But what happened downstream when the dam was built? No doubt Indigenous and local understanding of ecologic processes and impacts was never considered. How about our landscapes of leisure? Who has access to them? No one had access to this beach in Qingdao, China in 2021, when agricultural runoff caused an explosion of green algae to blanket the ocean. The seaside promenade in Zadar, Croatia, suffered heavy bombing in World War II. In 2005, architect Nikola Basic and expert stone carvers created a 70-meter-long sea organ, which relies on the random force and spacing of the wave to create musical chords. An underground resonating chamber comes alive when waves and wind push air through openings in the steps. This regeneration of the promenade reconnected the community to the sea and reclaimed the site as a place of play, contemplation, learning, and wonder. Wind and rain slowly carved the southern Utah rock. Shady ledges shelter bats and snakes and channel rare rainwater to grasses that flourish despite the unrelenting heat. The land, when we leave her alone, is resilient. But we rarely leave the land alone. We just continue to produce stuff. So now we must learn to plan, design, and construct our landscapes, cities, buildings, and spaces to be regenerative and resilient, to be just, equitable, and accessible for all living beings. And if we allow her, the land will guide us. Thank you.